You've heard a lot about electric vehicles. Here's a twist you probably didn't see coming. Georgia, right here in the South, is leading the country in EV manufacturing investment. From the factory floor to your driveway, we'll connect the dots between innovation, industry, and everyday life. Let's get into it. Welcome to the Battery Belt, a new podcast and webinar series. I'm your host, Gabby Pierre, strategy lead at the Georgia Network for Electric Mobility, also known as GNEM. We're part of a university-wide e-mobility initiative at the University of Georgia, and our mission is to accelerate the rapidly evolving world of electric mobility in the US, with a special focus on Georgia and the Southeast, now widely known as the Battery Belt. At GNEM, we envision Georgia as a global leading ecosystem for electric mobility. World-class manufacturing, research, and workforce development converge to drive the future of transportation. For our first episode, I'm thrilled to be joined by Mike Oatridge. Mike and I have worked closely over the past year on the Magnet proposal, the Mississippi-Alabama-Georgia Network for Electric Transportation and Technology. He serves as the CEO of Magnet and also leads the Alabama Mobility Partnership, or AMP. Before stepping into the electric mobility space, Mike had a distinguished career in the automotive industry, retiring as SVP or Senior Vice President at Honda. Mike, thank you so much for being here, and I'm excited to plug in and dive into this conversation with you.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So to start us all out, you've had a very impressive career in the automotive world. What led you from Honda to deciding to lead two major electric mobility initiatives in the Southeast?
Well, I retired in 2021 and I'm completely messing that up, as you can see. But the auto industry is going to go through one of the largest changes the auto industry has ever seen in the last 100 years. The change from gas-powered vehicles to electric-powered vehicles is huge, but at the same time, we're also seeing the rest. It's called CASE, so connected, automated, shared, and electrified. And the reason that electrified is so interesting to me is because of those other three. So a lot of the anxieties around why people don't buy electric cars right now are mitigated as soon as you see connected shared mobility, because if I don't own the car, I don't really care when it charges. And if it dropped me off and it leaves and it gets charged, or a different car comes back that is charged, all of those things basically enable electrification and really make it much more palatable to the consumers that are going to buy these vehicles. So to me, that was the challenge. And I didn't want to miss out on this big change. I also saw the Southeast having the opportunity to really seize, I'll call it, more than their fair share of the economic development growth that will surround this change in transportation.
Yeah, definitely. Like some of the quick stats I had to bring up was that the Southeast got around over 50% of the e-mobility related manufacturing investments in the US since 2022 alone, to the tune of over 80 billion, which is just insane to think about. That helps us run into our next question, which, Mike, in your own words, what is the battery belt and why should we care about it?
First of all, the battery belt isn't just about electric mobility. The year-over-year growth of electric cars worldwide is about 30% year over year. But if you look at BSS, or stationary storage systems that are going to store energy from solar or wind power or so on, that's experiencing a growth around 18-20%. And then, of course, we have the sustained growth for things like cell phones and all those kind of things that we already use. So there's this huge growth of a need for energy storage batteries to be produced in the United States. Of course, the South has evolved as kind of the new manufacturing base around electric cars, with the southeastern states producing a little over 4 million cars per year. kind of bookending that is that the South also has an abundance of raw materials from graphite that's available in Alabama and Georgia, from lithium that's available from Arkansas and Mississippi and Alabama and the Carolina. So really what you're talking about are these two bookends, right? We've got the customer base to produce vehicles in the South that are going to require batteries, and we've got the raw materials, and we're kind of missing that middle section, which is the refining of the materials, the production of those materials into cells and then packs. And therefore, this made it the perfect spot for this battery belt or the battery industry to really lay roots in this area and then create this battery belt, which is significantly across the southeastern United States.
Yeah, I think for me, it was really the most surprising thing to me was how much natural rare earth ore we have in the battery belt. Because the swath of lithium, which we can show later, across the southeast is just kind of insane to look at. And one was one of the big light bulb moments for me when we started working on the magnet proposal. Talking about magnet, what is magnet and why are you excited about it and how it was founded and all these things? I've heard this story many times before, but we have to get it on the record.
Basically, as you said earlier, it's the Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia Network for Electric Transportation. So we just talked about all of the opportunities that are surrounding electric mobility, battery manufacturing, because of the abundance of raw materials, because of the abundance of a consumer base in the form of electric vehicle production in the South. But we said, hey, we're missing this chunk in the middle. The problem is primarily battery production has occurred in Korea, Japan, and mostly China. So right now, about 90% of the batteries, when we started this, about 90% of all batteries, lithium ion batteries, were produced in China. So the problem is that we don't have the expertise, the knowledge, or the infrastructure to really support a battery industry in the Southeast. We have all the other components, but we're missing that. And if we individually said, hey, the University of Georgia is going to start a battery program, well, they might have one, two, three, four, five experts, but it's not going to get to a critical mass where we can really change this dynamic. University of Alabama might be the same. The University of Mississippi State might be the same. And then a whole bunch of smaller universities in between are the same, all have a little bit of expertise and a little bit of infrastructure kind of sprinkled all over, but we can't get the critical mass that way. So what do we do best in the South is we actually like each other. It's the best way I can describe it. So we can talk to each other and say, hey, this is what I have. What do you have? And we start to say, hey, together, if we collectively use our strengths and our research capabilities, we can overcome the very large hurdle that's in front of us in this battery technology. And the hurdle isn't going to be, how to refine materials. It's not going to be how to manufacture batteries. It's not going to be any of those things. It's going to be having the know-how and having the human capital to really change this dynamic and bring this industry that has been primarily overseas into a domestic arena as soon as possible so we don't miss the opportunities. So
Definitely.
Magnet is really, it's a great name. It's Magnet. It's attracting everybody together with one common cause to really drive as much of the economic development or venture capital that's required to support this change into the Southeast states.
Definitely. I'd love to talk more about the domestic supply chain and the batteries because I think for a lot of people, understanding the difference between a lateral supply chain relationship versus a fully verticalized supply chain and what that means for me as a consumer of an EV and what it costs to me, like making that really clear link is just complicated because it's just a complicated world of supply chain and logistics. So would love to talk about one, the difference between lateral supply chain relationships and what a fully verticalized supply chain is, but then also what that means for the cost of a battery and for the cost of electric vehicles to us as consumers.
Yeah, so If you look at the cost of a battery, about 75% of the cost of a battery is materials. And when we're talking about materials, everybody thinks about lithium instantly because it's called a lithium ion battery.
Right.
Lithium only makes up about 3% of the volume of most, they're all different because there's different chemistries, but generally about 3%. The rest of the materials, the biggest materials is graphite, and then there's the CAM materials or the cathode active materials. That's where you get into manganese and cobalt and all those
And
kind of materials.
nickel and all of those. Yeah.
Yeah. So to vertically integrate basically is very difficult because we just talked about we have a lot of these materials, but we don't have the refining capabilities to be able to change those raw materials into battery grade products. And a lot of people think, oh, China has not only the raw materials, but they also have the ability to change it to battery grade materials. That's somewhat true and somewhat a misnomer. A lot of the materials that are refined in China are not produced or mined in China. They're mined in Australia and Brazil and the Congo and lots of other places. They're shipped to China and they're refined there. Now, it would be really easier for us to say, hey, let's go copy the methodology that they're using in China to refine these materials, but we're not going to do it that way because in a lot of those cases, it's not environmentally friendly. It basically isn't applicable apples to apples for production in the United States. So therefore, that opens a huge door for research partners to work together with universities to look at things like instead of using acids to refine materials, we can look at spherization, we can look at micronization by utilizing mechanical separation methodology and many different other types of ways to refine those materials. So the key is we have to get to a vertical integration of materials in the United States. And that isn't just for security. That's what everybody says. Oh, of course we do, because we can't rely on China. The reality is that car companies have to create their own batteries to be able to stay profitable. So, easy way to think about that is you have an internal combustion engine in your car today. That internal combustion engine represents about 1/3 of the profit that a car company makes from selling that car. The easy way to think about that is car companies buy ingots of aluminum, melt them, build a block, they forge metals, they machine metals, and they basically produce through a lot of value add an engine that functions to produce power for that vehicle. And in doing so, that's their profit. So they're making 15 to 17% profit off that engine. So now let's remove that engine out of the car and replace it with a battery that is a purchased component and replace that 15 to 17% profit with a 1 to 2% profit. And all of a sudden, it's not viable for a car company to produce electric cars because they don't have control over the value add in that supply chain. So it's kind of chicken and the egg a little bit, but at the end of the day, I don't believe that car companies are going to be able to survive financially without integrating battery production into their supply stream. And to do that, they have to have control over the raw materials. So we really need to look at how we are going to start producing these raw materials and producing the refining capabilities to do it domestically and scale those appropriately as the EV industry grows. Now, we know the EV industry 6 months ago was booming, and everybody says the administration changed and that's changed. It's kind of true, but there was a year over year growth. Last year was 35%. This year it's 8%. If anybody comes to you and say, hey, there's a 28% growth in this market, you jump up and go, woo, this is great.
Right. Because the stats have been saying that the sales are still growing in
Yes.
all of the latest reports, like the IEA reports, etc., Cox Automotive reports.
Yep.
The sales are still growing right now.
Yeah, and actually we just hit 8%. So in the United States, between 15 and 17 million new cars are sold every year. Last year we broke 5%. This year we're on track to break 8%. So we're seeing this continued growth. And I think there's this misnomer out here that nobody's interested in EVs anymore, and that's just not true. But what's happening now is there's a lot more interest in the raw materials and the control of those raw materials. And there's actually quite a bit of federal dollars being poured into the development of that supply chain so that we can sustain a domestic industry.
Yeah. And the big thing we're landing on right now is that one, margins, profit margins in the automotive industry are pretty thin. And when you take a battery, which is a heavily processed product, and add that in, the margins are even thinner if you can't control the cost of goods sold. So the importance on verticalized supply chain, which is really controlling your costs on the refining the raw materials side, is being able to control your costs on the back end so that you can also reflect that in the price to me as the consumer of the electric vehicles as well.
It's exactly right. That's what has to happen. And it's where a lot of the focus is of Magnet is on the mining, the refining, and then actually the processing of batteries into cells as well. It's because we just don't have much expertise in that. And unfortunately, in the United States, it's a not so well-known fact, but startup of battery factories in the United States go through a sustained like over 1 year period with yields less than 60%, which means 40% of what they're making is scrap. So there's a lot of effort being put into and how to better sustain and start up these companies. And that is really where Magnet's wheelhouse is by utilizing the collective knowledge across the southeastern states from these R1 universities, providing a test bed for manufacturers to say, hey, how can we do this? And it's cost prohibitive in a lot of cases for them to do it because you go buy an SEM microscope for $7 million that you're going to use for a very short period of time if you're in industry. But of course, R1 universities have those resources and have the capability of being able to do the analysis on materials that private companies just couldn't see. So there's also really other cool stuff out there that we're working on with Magnet, which is like graphite, for example. It's not just mining, but there's synthetic graphite. And we're actually
Mhm.
in the midst of working with a company that is using scrap wood products and creating graphite from scrap wood products. So we got them in touch with Pacific Georges, the Westervelds, all of the big lumber suppliers out there, and looking at their scrap materials to produce battery quality graphite with. So lots of really interesting stuff going on in the battery supply chain area. And the South is kind of the epicenter of all of that activity right now.
Yeah. I'm guessing the synthetic graphite is easier to make than it is to mine the graphite in some way.
Yeah, both of them have unique properties, and almost all batteries that are produced commercially today have a mixture of the two types of graphite. Graphite is really one of the key ports of fast charging vehicles. So, how you coat that graphite, how it is adhered onto a thin sheet of copper to create the anode is a lot of research in that area. But at the end of the day, you need both. You need, don't get me wrong, you can make a battery with just natural graphite. You can make a battery with just synthetic graphite, but some of the best batteries is when we have a mixture of the two.
Yeah. The other part of what you just said that I'd love to ask you more about is the piece of why Magnet has a really strong value prop to industry is kind of the piece of the risk sharing of the new technology that needs to exist to be competitive. To what extent do you think some of that competitiveness will come from battery technology that we have not discovered or created yet? Because a lot of the conversations I have nowadays are about how solid state batteries are so low yield that they're basically theoretical. And there are other types of battery chemistry that we can already play with now that could be the next phase of batteries going even further. For example, GM had that announcement about their new batteries, etc. So would love to hear some of your thoughts on battery research and development in general as well.
Well, I think maybe I'll answer that question two different ways. So just imagine, hey, you've got a couple $100 million to play with. You say, hey, I want to start up a lithium extraction company utilizing the Smackover Basin, and I'm going to extract lithium out of it. And you go through all of the hoops and you figure out a new technology, maybe it's water membrane technology or something along those lines to extract that lithium. And now you have the lithium, and you can't just show up at the LGs or the CATLs or the Fords or the Hondas of the world with a bag of lithium and say, "You want to buy my lithium?" You have to show up with cells that have your lithium and your formulation inside those cells so that they can test your cells against their standard. Well, where would you go to have those cells manufactured? Unfortunately, when we started doing our initial research in Magna 2 years ago, there were 23 active battery labs in the United States. Most of those battery labs can only produce coin cells. There are a couple big ones. Dearborn, Michigan's one. There's BIC up in Indiana. But the capacity of these facilities is far less than the needs right now. So therefore, there is kind of this two-pronged problem. Even if you come up with a brand new technology to produce either raw materials cheaper domestically than you can buy them on the open market, global open market, that could be a breakthrough technology, but you can't sell it because you can't produce the cells. So we really looked at how do we produce a facility and the people that are required to run that facility to do testing on these batteries to say, yes, they perform in the way you want them to, or no, they don't. So at the University of Alabama, we're in the midst of building a battery lab, which we'll be able to produce not only coin cells, but single to multi-layer pouch cells at volume from, 1 to about 15 amp battery packs in several different formats. This will allow us to do not only breakthrough technology, saying, how do we get into lithium salts? Is LFP really the answer? Are there alternatives to cobalt out there that we can play along with? But I think even more than that, the technology in the battery manufacturing space, in my history with automotive manufacturing, I would call it antiquated. China is really, really producing things in small scale. And then if you need 100 of them, okay, I'll put in one module. And if I need 1,000 of them, I'll put in 10 of those modules. The United States really doesn't think in those terms. They say, okay, if I'm going to produce, and if I need to produce 1,000 of them, I'm going to create an integrated line that has a throughput of 1,000. And therefore, my manufacturing technology is going to be very different than in a module base. So how do we start looking at existing technologies that have never been used in the auto industry, but are used in other areas to really drive change in battery manufacturing? We're working with a company right now that it's really well known for atomic level deposition. So putting a coating on that graphite we were talking about to allow faster charging rates. How do we change? But of course, to do that is cost prohibitive in an industrial setting. But that doesn't mean that we need to figure out that breakthrough into that. So at Magnet, really, we see research having two major outputs. The first one is innovation, like you just said. Hey, how can we have a new battery chemistry? How can we have a new battery manufacturing method? How can we have a new raw material refining method? All those things, we want to have an innovative breakthrough that then leads to a better, more cost-effective battery for the auto industry. The reality of that is you've got to be really good and you got to have a lot of funding and you got to be lucky. You can't guarantee luck. We can maybe guarantee the other two, but you can't guarantee luck. But in the pursuit of that innovative breakthrough, we're going to learn a lot about a battery industry that really doesn't exist in the United States and has never existed in the United States. To me, that's the pot of gold. So how do we understand where the gaps in our education system are that are hindering us from making these breakthroughs and then driving that into the K through 12, 2-year college, and 4-year systems to produce human capital or talent to really bring us to the next level? I call it kind of hunting and farming. We're hunting for this brand new breakthrough in technology, but we're really farming the skills and the knowledge to allow us to get to that through that iterative process.
Definitely. And that's a good segue to some other things we should talk about along workforce, job creation. So, one of the most exciting parts of EV transition and this new kind of era for the automotive industry and future mobility is job creation and workforce development. In your opinion, how is EV growth impacting workforce development across the Southeast and the Battery Belt? And are there any initiatives that have stood out to you as particularly effective?
Yeah, two things have to happen. We need to retrain an existing auto workforce in the South, but also we now need to gain skills in battery and battery manufacturing. So the way that we have approached that at Magnet is really to look at how do we estimate the growth of this industry appropriately. And if we understand the growth, then we can understand scale and requirements. The problem is that the US auto industry has really been based off of mandates or government regulations. And I'm not talking about IRA, I'm talking about CAFE. So CAFE is the combined average fuel economy, which has been around now for 8 administrations in Washington. It's nothing new. It's been through Republican, it's been through Democratic leadership. And basically, what it does is it dictates to car companies the required miles per gallon that their sales fleet average has to make. So, just to make that clear, if you're Ford, you have to sell F-150s and some of their small cars like Focuses and so on. The total amount of sales of those cars, the average fuel economy of all of those sales this year has to be 50 miles per gallon approximately. You can't do that unless some of that fleet is electric. So the problem is that what's happening now is car companies are saying, if I don't do that, I either have to buy ZEV or zero emission vehicle credits for somebody who is building electric cars, or I have to pay fines. So I have to sell some mixture of electric car. But the problem is that the consumer doesn't really care that you have a mandate, and they're going to buy the car that they want. And therefore, there's this mismatch. And if the easiest way to say this is right now, we just finished saying about 8% of the cars sold in the United States are electric. And what percentage of car commercials are about electric cars? More than 50%, probably. So there is this mismatch. And therefore, it's really difficult to predict the growth of the EV industry in the United States because as American citizens in general, we don't really listen to say, hey, you have to do this, therefore you do it. We do whatever we want, right? So
Or the conversation I tend to have with people is I think people are going to buy EVs because they become the most cost effective and convenient option, not because you're telling people that they need to buy it.
that's correct. But how do I predict a consumer behavior when there's no model to follow? So this was one of the very, very early things that Magnet took on, which is, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we had a better way of predicting consumer behavior? And I would love to have a crystal ball, and I wish we had one, but we don't. But we really started asking questions, just like you did, Gabby. It's like, well, why wouldn't you buy an electric car? And we talk to literally thousands of people and say, hey, if gas was 20 bucks a gallon, would you buy an electric car? And everybody says, yeah. Well, hey, if you're mandated to buy an electric car, are you going to buy one? No. Hey, if I wasn't worried about finding a charger, are you more or less likely? And we started really defining what are those anxieties that are causing people either to move towards electric cars or away from electric cars. And then we engaged statics and analytics people, computer programming, and AI, and a lot of other technologies. And over the last 2 years, we've developed a program called Evolve, which is a EV prediction tool that can very accurately produce EV predicting growth down to a zip code, which means we can, in the state of Alabama anyway right now, we can predict EV consumer behavior with about 98% confidence. And every time I say that, it sounds like that can't be true. And I've checked the numbers myself because I don't believe it could be true. But we are, for the last 6 months, accurately predicting EV consumer behavior based off of their anxieties. We have just recently been able to purchase all of the data that is required for us to expand this program into the Southeast, which we will have up and running within about 6 to 8 months. And once that's done, we'll then expand to a national model. Why we're doing the Southeast first? Alabama kind of sits in the middle. We're about 1.5% electric cars. Georgia is ahead of us and also has a much more metropolitan area. And then Mississippi is behind us. And because we have partnerships with those states, we can really get in and understand what is it that's missing in our modeling to be able to say this is why people are or are not buying electric cars. And it's funny because it's stuff that you wouldn't think of. If you want to drive a convertible, you can't drive an EV because there are none.
No, not even Mini has made their convertibles EV, which is interesting. Like they offer some EVs, but they haven't made the convertibles EVs, which will be interesting to see how that plays out.
But it's interesting because as we grow through this, we're really starting to listen to consumers for the first time. Up till now, it's really been the consumers are, or not really the consumers, the car companies are being told they have to produce vehicles with these characteristics and therefore make them for sale. But we've never really listened to the consumer. To back to your point is if we make vehicles that are viable and people want, then I think they'll come to it. But it's not only the vehicles, it's education. I live in Birmingham, Alabama, and I drive to Tuscaloosa. And on the way to work every single day, it's about 60 miles. I pass those big blue signs on the highway that tell me there's gas stations and McDonald's and everything. And I never, ever have passed a sign that says there's a charger here because I don't need it in my car because my car in my Navi system, it shows me where all the charging stations are. But if I don't drive an electric car, my perception is there are no chargers.
Right.
There's thousands and thousands of chargers that nobody knows about. So how do we overcome these anxieties through education programs is a challenge.
Yep. And through a lot of coordination with infrastructure, etc. Because one thing that was interesting, I was in Germany a couple weeks ago for some work visits. And to your point, the signs there actually have whether the gas stations have an electric charger with a special electric charger symbol on the big highway signs. It's actually really cool to see on the highways because I'm like, that is great. Because that would at least give people a peace of mind knowing, oh, I've passed four of these. There's a weird subconscious. I've passed four of these signs with the chargers on it. So if I needed one and I didn't have to go through my system to find one, I know that there's some options there as well. We have time for one or two more questions. I guess the big one is if you could leave our listeners with one key takeaway about the battery belt, what would it be?
I think the best takeaway is I think I've already mentioned it. The battery belt is really set up because we have the consumer base, which is the OEMs producing 4 million cars, and we have access to raw materials. So the battery belt is really set up because of those existing entities. Therefore, it makes the Southeastern Corridor the perfect place to produce raw materials, refined materials, and batteries that will be consumed by the auto industry.
Amazing. Well, Mike, thank you so much for joining us for the very first inaugural episode of the Battery Belt. Until next time, keep your batteries charged and stay tuned.